what we're going to have today is we're not going to get extremely deep in the weeds on PPP loan forgiveness. We're taking a very high-level view of really the basics of what you need to know right now as we stand in the process. And certainly we'll have opportunity for some questions at the end. But yeah, again, we're trying to take a big step back and look, okay, we're here late September, early October. Where are we now, and what do you need to be doing to planning most effectively? So keep that in mind as we go through our presentation today. So yeah, again, in the spirit of that 64,000 foot view, if you will, where are we? So you borrowed 10 weeks worth of 2019 payroll costs. You've got 24 weeks to spend it. Think about that in terms of math. 10 weeks worth of payroll and 24 weeks to spend it should be able to accomplish most of that spending, if not all, with all payroll expense. And that's our advice, is don't worry about those non-payroll expenses at this point. Look at the payroll as being your primary expenditure that you're focused on for qualifying for forgiveness. And just by simple math, you've got nearly 2.5 times the time period of what you use to qualify to spend that money. Should be doable for just about everybody. And so the one caveat there, if you received your loan after July 17th, there were some loans made between July 17th and I believe August 8th was the last day, your covered period ends December 31st. No covered periods go beyond the end of this year. So those who received their loans between July 17th and August 8th do have a shorter than 24-week covered period. But for all intents and purposes, we do not expect that to have a substantial impact on your ability to achieve forgiveness.
The important thing to remember now is that forgiveness is not automatic. There are a whole lot of specific steps that a borrower needs to take and follow the specific instructions on the forgiveness application in order to get the loan forgiveness. As you heard from Keith, it's not hard to qualify, right? And most borrowers will be able to do that by payroll spending alone, which is what we recommend because you got to do all the math for the payroll anyway. Why complicate matters? The tricky part is it's hard to document exactly. And by reading the instructions or working with your farm credit consultant, you'll be able to know exactly what it is that you need to supply as documentation and when, because payroll documentation comes in certain prescribed intervals already, quarterly or annual, depending on the type of payroll that you have. And those are going to be a big part of your forgiveness application.
So let's do a little bit of a reality check with regard to the timeline. As mentioned previously, all borrowers have 24 weeks. I know that many of you, when you applied for your loan, it was under that 8-week rule, but that change that went into effect in June with the passage of the Flexibility Act was retroactive for all PPP loans. So all PPP loans have 24 weeks, with that exception of those loans made after July 17th. They have a period less than 24 weeks, but definitely longer than 8 weeks. Then you have an additional 10 months after the end of that 24-week period or December 31st, whichever came first, before you are required to submit your application for forgiveness. Essentially, your loan deferment date is 10 months after the end of 24 weeks. Or initially it was 6 months. Now it's that 10 months after 24 weeks. So basically 15 and a half months is how that works out when you go through all the math. So a significant amount of time. Much of that documentation, as Erin spoke of just a minute ago about, some of that payroll documentation will not be available possibly until early January, depending on what type of payroll you file. And we'll go into a little more detail on that in just a second. So what does this effectively mean for you? No one, and we mean no one, that borrowed PPP funds will miss a deadline this year. Just the simple fact of that math, when you add 24 weeks to 10 months, that's greater than 12 months. You received your loan during 2020, you will not miss a deadline in 2020. So, and what we envision is most of the applications for forgiveness are going to happen sometime in early 2021, right about that same time you're working with your tax preparer and if you're working with someone on payroll to get all those W-2s prepared, to get your taxes filed. So it's going to be a busy season for filing paperwork, a little more so than usual this year.
Okay, so we've got a lot of questions. I've spent all my money and I'm ready to apply. One of the most important things we need to consider is my documentation complete? If you do your own payroll, you're going to need the completed payroll tax forms that span your covered period. So if you are able to use an 8-week covered period and you spent all the money before June 30th and you file a 941, you are one of the very few borrowers who is able to apply right now. If your covered period spilled into the third quarter, you still are going to have to file all your third quarter payroll returns before you're going to have all the documentation you need to be eligible to apply for forgiveness. And if you're a 943 filer, the way things still stand, since that's your payroll tax return, you're going to need to file that before you can apply for forgiveness. And that doesn't happen until January because it's an annual form. We've gone through this on a few other office hours. That's just the way SBA has written the rules. They don't want to have you make completely new payroll reports. And we strongly advise against filing any draft or incomplete reports because think of the disaster that could create. It just means we need to be patient if you're doing your own payroll that it will be January before you can apply for forgiveness. If you're a 941 filer, it's saying it's going to be October at least. And if you needed more than 8 weeks for your covered period, right? Everybody had the option of 24 weeks. If it took more than 8 weeks, your covered period is automatically 24 weeks. It has nothing to do with how long it took you to spend the money. So there is no 15-week covered period. So if you needed the 24-week covered period, you're really looking at the end of that 24-week covered period and whatever payroll tax form is spanning that. Right? There are a lot of banks that are not yet accepting forgiveness applications because the 24 weeks hasn't ended yet. And KABBAGE is one of those, so we want to keep that in mind. I know a lot of folks on the call have worked with KABBAGE. The other thing, and you'll hear Keith talk about this a little more later, is that even though some banks tested the waters by submitting a few forgiveness applications to SBA when the portal opened, not one of them has been granted forgiveness yet. SBA has 90 days from when they get the application, and they've not acted on any of them yet. They're about halfway through that 90-day period. So a lot remains to be seen.
So, of course, we're all hearing the news here and there about, there's these bills to Congress. We hear quite a bit from folks that, hey, I heard that they changed the rules and that if I have a bill, my loan is under this amount, I don't have to, it's a simple form, I don't have to document anything. Well, none of that has passed. Those are rumors. Yes, there are proposals to change some of that, but we need to wait out the process. And the morning after the presidential debate, if you're not aware that this is an election year, I don't know what we can do. This is the most unusual election year that I've ever seen, and certainly we need to wait out the process. The reality, the stark reality is there's probably not going to be any changes to the program until after Election Day. Yes, it is possible that something could get through, but the closer we get to that date in November, the less likely it is anything's going to happen. So we just wait that out. And, just like as we've said before, the rule of thumb with estate planning is you make the plan based on the rules as they are today, not what you anticipate them being tomorrow. Same thing with this program. We, encourage you to plan for everyone needing to submit an application for forgiveness, and that you'll need to document the spending in the right way, regardless of what size loan you had. So just play by the rules as they stand today. If they change, we'll keep you updated, and hopefully those changes will be to your benefit.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick tour through how the universally applicable forgiveness rules work, how we can help you obtain forgiveness on the first time with as little pain as possible, and most importantly, who you talk to at FCE to help you out.
So what if you've got questions about completing your application? So, and this would be, you know, those questions about, you know, how do I calculate this? Where do I put this on what form? Those sorts of things. We encourage you to go to farmcrediteast.com/PPP consult. That's where you can get connected with one of our Farm Credit East consultants who have been, you know, we've been studying this from day one and are experts in this process and can help you walk through that.
If you have questions about the process, we have set up regional PPP representatives to help answer that. And that'll be for questions like, where do I find the forms? When can I actually apply? And who do I send the form to? That's going to be these folks that Keith's going to outline for you next.
So yeah, this is a pretty robust slide, but I'd encourage you to find the corner of the slide that applies to the branch office that you do business with Farm Credit East. Find that and then find the corresponding name at the top of the list. The easy way to get in touch is you see the name on the list, that name first, do a first name dot last name at farmcrediteast.com. That's how we arrange our email addresses. So I'm not going to read through that entire list, but I'll let it sit for just a moment so you have a chance to find yourself. But, you know, Bill Zweigbaum, I'm sure many folks know him. He's been with Farm Credit for a number of years as a consultant up in the northern New York area. He's our northern region representative. Martin Knapp out there in western New York. Evan Richards up in Maine, and he'll be covering kind of the main offices and some of that northeastern New England offices of Farm Credit. And then Tom Daly here in the southern region which includes, now it's always fun when we're talking regions and Farm Credit, it's relative, right? So I don't think anyone from Connecticut ever thought they were from the South, but in terms of Farm Credit's regions, they're from the South. So, so those are those folks, and certainly if in doubt, and you can't get in touch with them, you can always call your branch office and ask to be referred. But we'd encourage you to call directly to these folks or email directly to these folks and cut out the middle person, so to speak.
Okay, so a borrower will submit the forgiveness application. You can prepare it yourself. You can hire someone to prepare this to take away all of the headaches. It then goes to the lender, who has the responsibility to do a quality control review, not only to make sure that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, but to make sure that all of the required information has been included. If you're missing something, the lender will likely return it to you to say, hey, you need to add some things here so that you have a complete application. We cannot submit an incomplete application to SBA, or of course, it really runs the risk of being denied. Once it passes the lender's quality control review, it goes to SBA, and SBA has three options. It will either approve the application as presented, in which case it'll send the money to the lender to pay off not only the loan amount, but also the interest that's accrued to that date. The opposite of that is a denial, where they say, no way, and that can be appealed by the borrower if that's the decision. That also involves an audit process. There is an in-between approach where SBA says we will grant you partial approval of forgiveness, not for every dollar that you have borrowed, but for some of it or most of it. If you don't agree with that, you can also appeal that decision, but there's a key reason why your entire PPP loan may not be forgiven, and we want you to know that right now. So Keith's going to go through what that is.
So there's EIDL program. As you probably will recall, that when the CARES Act, which started the PPP loan program, established that program, was passed, there was money put into the EIDL program, which is SBA's disaster loan program. Well, and that program existed prior to CARES Act. The CARES Act just pumped some extra money into it and added this idea of these non-refundable advances, these advances that were essentially grants. Well, farms were not eligible in the first round. Well, then, somewhere along the line, Congress, changed the rules a bit, added some more money, and opened up eligibility for farms. So the way this timeline worked is that, since if you had an EIDL loan and then you got your PPP loan, you did not, that advance essentially was refinanced into the PPP loan. But when it happened in reverse, there's EIDL loans when farmers became eligible. I mean, everybody in farm country was advertising this as free money. Well, that was true to an extent that up to the extent that you had a PPP loan. If you already had a PPP loan on the books, it's not exactly free money. So essentially what happens is, because there is this general rule in some of these government programs is you don't get the double dip, is that since you got a PPP loan, you're not going to get forgiveness for the EIDL advance amount. And of course, that's up to $10,000. So essentially how this works is the bank submits that forgiveness application to the SBA. SBA then cross-checks and says, oh, well, Joe Smith Farms has a EIDL advance for $8,000. Everything else looks good, but we're going to give you forgiveness up less $8,000. So that borrower, Joe Smith Farms, would have a PPP loan balance remaining of $8,000 after it all said and done. So we just want you to make sure that you're aware of that, because again, the way it was advertised, people thought it was free money, and it was an incredibly simple process. You just went onto the SBA site, you filled out the form, you submitted a few documents, and 3 days later there was up to $10,000 sitting in your bank account. I had folks that filled out the forms and then called me and said, where'd this money come from? So, well, that's what they advertise, quick and easy advances. So, but be aware that if you have both, you will have a balance remaining on your PPP loan, even if you spent all of the money the right way. And so you will be between you and your lender to decide how you want to address that remaining balance at the end of things.
All right, so how can Farm Credit East help you with PPP forgiveness? We have a team of PPP expert consultants that are available to either book a time and go over your application and your specific questions, or even better yet, take the whole headache away from you by preparing your application. You can do this by visiting farmcrediteast.com/PPP consult. There's a quick form there to gather some of the most basic information we'll need to get started on your application. It'll be things like the type of business structure you have, meaning are you an LLC taxed as a partnership? Are you an S corporation? Things like that. The date you got your PPP funds, who your lender is, and we can help with any of those. So make sure you complete that as accurately as possible so that we can get started and make sure that the schedule is filled appropriately, because as Keith said, there's going to be a mad rush for January time slots, as so many folks are going to be able to apply at that point in the agriculture industry. And we want to make sure that we've got that scheduled well ahead of time to make the best use of everyone's time and not have anyone have to worry about, are they going to make it in? Right. If you want to do your application yourself, we'll point you to the Farm Credit East Resource Hub, where we've got the answers to the frequently asked questions posted and updated, so you can find those right there as well.
So what about other lenders, such as KABBAGE? We can certainly provide that consulting service to assist with preparation of the forgiveness application for any bank. It doesn't have to be a loan held by Farm Credit East. It can be any bank. The main thing we'll just need to know is, is there anything unique about that bank's process that is unique to that bank compared to as opposed to just the SBA requirements. The SBA requirements will be the same for any lender. That's why, we're confident we'll be able to help you prepare that application without any real issue. But we'll just have a few extra questions for you about, who is your bank, who's your loan officer, and can you send us any forms that they are requesting? And in the case of an online bank like KABBAGE, we'll have to work through some of the finer details of how do we navigate that bank's submission system. And just as an FYI, for those of you who do have a loan through KABBAGE, I know a number of Farm Credit East customers went through KABBAGE as the lender. They have been working on a portal. The most recent update we have says that it takes almost 3 hours to get that well-organized, complete application submitted. They are certainly working to reduce that time, but as you can imagine, it is a bit of a challenging process when the rules are changing as we go. And then, that's just the submission, and you'll still have additional time getting all that documentation ready to go and ready to submit in the portal. So certainly stay tuned to that. Be in touch with KABBAGE. I know the last time I checked, they were still suggesting that folks wait till the end of their 24-week period before they submit their applications there. That gives them time, and it also gives them time to wait out any changes that Congress might dream up.
They're a little distracted right now, I think, though.
Yep.
If there's for a year for tax planning, this is it, right? Because we had a pretty big tax overhaul not too long ago. And as we've developed the guidance on the PPP money, we heard Congress say and write very explicitly that PPP money was not income. However, IRS came right back and said, yes, but expenses paid with forgiven debt are not deductible. So what does that mean for you? As a PPP borrower, at the end of the year, it's going to be very important because that's the date, the cutoff for filing the 2020 tax return. It's important to understand where your tax advisor stands and how they want to be preparing that application. Now is a really good time to run those scenarios so that you know what to expect and when, if in fact, these two groups, Congress and the IRS, cannot agree on how to handle this. And there's a lot of questions that still remain about what if this loan gets forgiven in 2021? What will happen with 2020 expenses? Are we going to have to go back and amend? And we don't see that as really the route that they would want to go because that's a windfall for accountants, as in more paperwork. However, it is going to need to be addressed in future years. And if you're going to have a tax liability related to this money, which it's still free money, so if you have to share a percentage of it back with the government because that's the rule, we want you to not be surprised by that. That would be a worst case scenario planning thing that your accountant can walk you through so you know what that number is and put that aside so that you're not surprised and it's not a hardship when that comes due if it does. So what we're advising is definitely reach out to your tax professional, your tax advisor, so that you can run the scenarios both ways and understand what the likely outcomes are going to be given the year you've had. Because one thing we can say, no matter who you are, 2020 has not been a typical year. And with all the nuances that go along with tax preparation and planning, let's get the real numbers in place so we know exactly what to expect. Let's not guess and be surprised.
I'll add one quick comment for the Farm Credit East customers, those who Farm Credit East does your tax preparation. You'll be getting pay attention to your inbox or your mailbox. You'll be getting a little newsletter from our tax team here shortly addressing the PPP tax considerations as well as several other tax considerations with all the various other programs that came about as a result of the CARES Act and just other tax issues. So be looking for that. I think that's scheduled to go out within the next week or so. So we're going to sum up at this point. Again, we said this was a high-level review, not getting super deep in the weeds here, but certainly are going to save time for some questions here. The things that we really want you to take away from today are you're not going to miss a deadline in 2020. We continue to get calls from folks that think that there is a deadline on, sometime in September that they needed to get something done, or sometime in October. But the pure and simple facts are that it's a 15.5-month deadline after you received your PPP fund. So you still have time to get yourself organized to do this the right way the first time. Many of you, if not most of you, will be applying sometime during the first quarter of 2021. That's really the time frame that you'll be looking at for when you will be submitting your PPP application, forgiveness application. It's likely that if Congress is going to do something with this, and if IRS is going to clarify some rulings, it should be done by then. I said should. It's 2020 after all, and let's just hope that 2021 is a lot better and a lot different. And then just let us know how we can help. If you're interested in working with one of our consultants on helping get your application prepared, taking that burden of having to learn all that information yourself off your plate, go to farmcrediteast.com/PPP consult, put in that little bit of information, and then we'll follow back up with you and get you signed up. And for your tax planning, certainly call your tax advisor today. Get in that queue. I mean, we're the fourth quarter of the fiscal year starts tomorrow, and their plates are going to get filled up pretty quick. And certainly, I know here at Farm Credit, we are able to visit with customers a little bit more than we had earlier, but we still have some restrictions in place, and I'm sure other firms have some restrictions. So it's going to be more, if for no other reason, just to make sure that you get in the queue because of potential restrictions and how easily you would be able to visit. Certainly want you to get in that line today. So go ahead and when you get done with this call today, I know we had some rain in a lot of parts in the region, so last night, so maybe you had a little extra time anyway. So give them a call, get yourself on that list.
All right. And Heather, now's a good time for us to start with some questions. I see there's a few in the chat. Can you hand them back to Keith and me? We'll take them one at a time and get as far as we can in our allotted hour.
Hi, Erin. This is Chris Lawton. I think I'll be actually giving you the questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, so we have a couple that have come in. One is a clarification on the forgiveness period for application. The question is, my PPP loan began on May 11th, so my 24-week period will end on September 30th, and I will need to file my 941 form for the fourth quarter. My understanding is I will not be able to begin applying for forgiveness until after the first of the year in 2021. Is that correct?
Correct. The instructions for the forgiveness application say that you need the payroll tax forms that span your covered period. So if you go midway through a period, you're going to need the report for that whole period. So if it goes into quarter four, yes, you will need the quarter four quarterly report.
Okay.
I'll add one thing. We talk a lot about, you hear us saying 941 and 943s a lot, but we also don't want to forget that there's those state payroll tax forms as well. If you're using some of the employer contributions towards or the employer share of those state and local taxes, you need those as documentation as well. So don't forget about it. It's not just 941s and 943s, it's the state taxes as well.
Okay. Question regarding calculation of FTEs. I know that calculating FTEs, full-time equivalents, means 40 hours per employee without regard to overtime worked, meaning that an employee can work 60 hours and it's still just one FTE. But does overtime pay get included in the amount paid during the covered period?
Yes, it does. It's gross wages. So, overtime pay, bonuses, all of that gets counted in, but it's cash compensation. So that's the only nuance with that. So if you have an employee where They receive some non-cash compensation, such as the value of, a home. You provide housing, for example. That's non-cash compensation. That would not count. But cash compensation, regular wages, salary, bonuses, overtime, hazard pay, whatever you call it, if it's cash that is going to show up on their W-2, it counts.
Okay. A question came through that was basically answered in chat, but I'll ask you about it anyway, just for clarification. If we got our loan from a local bank or another lender other than FCE, do we need to apply for forgiveness through them, or can we hire you?
You need to submit your forgiveness application to the lender that holds your loan. However, we would be happy to work with you no matter who your lender is, if you'd like us to take those headaches away.
Okay. Question about payroll documentation. What other payroll documentation is needed besides the 941 or 943 form?
So I mentioned just a minute ago the state payroll tax forms. That's required in there. You also need to document the if the employer is providing healthcare expenses, if the employer is providing retirement expenses, which you wish to include in that, you'll need some form of documentation of that. And typically the documentation is not a printout from your own records. You need to show it's sort of a two-sided coin. You need to show that you need to show an invoice or a statement from the provider. So let's use healthcare, for example. Let's say, you're using, a Blue Cross Blue Shield as your healthcare provider. You need a statement from that provider that shows the amount that you owed as the employer share, and you also need to show evidence that it was paid. You can't just show a bill, because the bill doesn't mean it was paid. But a statement, it can be a statement that shows the payment when the payment was received, but it also has to show specifically the employer share. How much of that healthcare are you paying as the employer towards their healthcare, and does not include what the employee is contributing towards that health insurance. So it may be a matter in some of these cases of working with that provider to get a statement. Believe me, all of these insurance providers are well aware of these requirements because there's literally thousands upon hundreds of thousands of small businesses that have received PPP loans in the country, and they're all going to be looking for similar documentation. So work with your providers to get that. But is that required? It's only required if you are claiming that as part of your amount. If you can get it all with cash compensation, just use the tax forms and use that will be your documentation. We're encouraging folks, let's go with the easiest path in terms of the minimal amount of documentation to get you what you need. And that's the one nice feature of that Flexibility Act is that it gives us that 24-week period. We've got plenty of time. You may not need some of those other things.
Okay. We have a two-part question here, so I'll ask them separately. Is there a sample of the application form for forgiveness so people can see it and start gathering the documentation?
Yes, it's posted on the farmcrediteast.com resource hub for COVID.
Okay. And the web address for that again?
farmcrediteast.com/resource hub, I believe.
Okay.
Yep. I think that's posted as a link to the SBA form so that it remains updated, if I remember correctly.
Okay, thank you. And then the second part of the question is, what type of documentation might be expected from my firm, as I'm a fishing company that uses mostly 1099 payroll and has minimal W-2 employees?
So what we know today, you will need to provide the 1099s that you issue to those fishermen. The W-2s will not be necessary, and the payroll tax filings will not be necessary. It'll be very similar to the documentation that you provided to qualify for the loan. And the fishing vessels were a very unique last minute and literally last minute addition to the scenario, and that they were added just prior to that, what we thought was the deadline of June 30. Now that got extended to August, but those fishing vessels came in at the very last minute. There's not a lot of specific mention of the fishing vessels in the documentation requirements in terms of the instructions because of that last minute nature of it. I'd expect we're going to get a little more, but what we believe it'll be essentially the same sort of documentation that you use to qualify it. There's 1099s for those fishermen. And then the other thing that we do know is that the SBA has said that all of those fishing vessel PPP loans will be reviewed by SBA, mostly because of the fact that they got added very late in the game. There were a lot of those crew members that were eligible to go, that received those 1099s. They were told in the first 2.5 months of this deal to go out and apply on your own. So that's the reason that fishing vessels were excluded initially, is that they said the individual 1099 recipients were eligible and they didn't want that double dipping, so to speak. And so they're going to review those to make sure that there weren't any crossovers there. And so just warning you that the forgiveness process for a fishing vessel may be a little more drawn out than many other businesses, because we know they're all going to be reviewed by SBA prior to being eligible for forgiveness. You have anything you want to add to that, Erin?
Just to be clear, because the way Chris asked the question sounded like there were 1099s and minimal W-2, meaning there is still W-2.
Yeah.
So if you have a mix of activity, you're going to need to follow the instructions for both versions of that. If it's just 1099s, that'll go one way. If it's just W-2s, it'll go the other way. But if you have a mix of types of compensation, your application is going to be certainly more complicated, and you're going to need to follow the rules for that. And if you can make your forgiveness case with just one version, that'll certainly simplify things, but know that all of it will count. And that's just the one thing that I wanted to add. It's not one or the other.
Yep.
Okay.
Great point. I missed the W-2 part of the question.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification, Erin. What I think is an easy question here. Can all the PPP loan amount be used for payroll? If not, what portion can be used?
Absolutely. Use it all on payroll, because you're going to have to do all of the math on payroll to justify your forgiveness for your application. So if you can use it all for payroll, that's going to cut down on the amount of work that you need to do. There are other expenses if you absolutely can't figure out how to pay it on payroll. Those other expenses would qualify: rent, utilities, and certain loan interest. However, if you can do it all on payroll, it's that Paycheck Protection Program. That is exactly what it is intended for. And since you borrowed 10 weeks worth of payroll and have 24 weeks to spend it, that should definitely be your focus, and that time period should be totally doable.
Okay. Question about a self-employed or a sole proprietor person with no payroll that qualified under farm profit. How do they show proof of earnings or owner draw?
So and Chris, that's another easy question. So I was glad that I got to take one too. That is actually the easiest forgiveness application, because you already have your documentation in place. The documentation for sole proprietors with no payroll is exactly the same documentation you use to qualify. You are required to submit your 2019 income tax return. Specifically, if you're sole proprietor, either your Schedule F or Schedule C, depending on which of those you file, what type of business, and some actually have a little of both, but typically it's one or the other. Now, the only nuance with that, the only really concern that you may have is that If you had not yet filed your tax return when you applied for your PPP and you used a draft of that Schedule F, and when you filed the tax return, it was different than what you filed, and maybe significantly different, such as that you had zero depreciation in before, and then you had, several $100,000 of depreciation in on the version you filed, that could create some challenges for you. But the documentation is the Schedule F or Schedule C that you filed in your 2019 tax return. You don't have to take it. You don't have to show draws. You don't have to show anything. You use that documentation. And the reason is that, SBA looked at this, and for the owner compensation, and that's the rule, the general rule for all owners is you're using your 2019 income, because they didn't want to create a windfall for business owners at the expense of employees. So they're saying, you don't get to keep any more of this PPP money than what you kept in 2019, and so you're limited to that as the both the documentation and the amount that you're eligible for.
Okay, thank you. Let me just check out another couple of questions here. Is Farm Credit East, and I don't know if you can speak for KABBAGE as well, accepting forgiveness applications at this point for those who might be eligible? Is there a portal to submit the application and documentation?
We are not officially accepting applications yet. We are in a test phase with SBA, as Keith said earlier on. Even though they accepted their first application in August, they have not yet approved anybody for forgiveness. So if you, just like buying a truck, right, by the first model year of a new vehicle, you have the experience of being what's called the bleeding edge, because you're going to be one of the test cases, and it'll be 90 days before you know whether or not it works. So there are several nuances still to be worked out. We want to make sure we've got that right before we start submitting all these applications and then have to go resubmit them because something was missing. If you remember back when you applied for your PPP loan, the paper form that you filled out did not have all of the information needed to actually process your PPP loan. And that meant a lot of folks had to go back through and do a second version of their application to get all the required information. And we know time is important, and nobody wants to go through that experience again. So we want to make sure that we've got everything that SBA wants all at once before we start taking those applications that we're just going to have to redo over again.
Okay. Another question here. Can you use wages paid to part-time employees as well as full-timers that you named as FTEs?
So I'm going to unpack that question a little bit, because I think there's more of a question there than maybe what the person who asked it realizes. So let me first clarify what an FTE is. An FTE is a full-time equivalent. So all paid employees are considered in the determination of your FTEs. If someone happens to work part-time, it's based on the hours worked by all of your employees. Again, we're capping you're required to cap the hours at 40 hours per week, because they do not want you, they are trying to end up with a similar number of employees. But if you have a person who's part-time, they absolutely count as an FTE. They might be a less than 1.0 FTE. If somebody's working 20 hours a week, they would be a 0.5 FTE. So absolutely, they count and would be included in your FTEs that you submit with your forgiveness application. So that, in essence, answers the question both sides. Is that I wanted to make sure, because the way the question was asked, it sounded like there may have been a little confusion on how the FTEs are calculated, in the terms that every employee counts towards the FTE. All those hours work count towards FTE calculation. And so, yeah, absolutely, they count. And the wages certainly count. I mean, yeah, can't emphasize that enough. If you're paying wages, if they're cash wages, they count. The only exception are to the owners let's say you're a corporation and you're paying wages to owners who own more than 5% of the corporation, they are not counted at any level. You're using your 2019 compensation as the eligible wage towards forgiveness. So that is the one exception to that all wages count rule.
Oh, actually two more, right? So no non-residents and no
great point.
compensation over 100,000.
Yep.
Yes, absolutely. Great point, Erin.
Okay. So another question here is, if we spend all the PPP money on payroll, but it's spent with, let's say 9 weeks and part of the 10th week, how is that handled?
Meaning what's your covered period? If it's not 8 weeks, and that only applies as an option for those who got their loans before June 5th, right? If it's not 8 weeks, it is automatically 24 weeks. There is no in between. Those are your two choices.
And it's okay if your wages paid exceed your PPP loan.
Right. The idea was to get more money into the economy and more money to payroll, more money to the employees so that they didn't apply for unemployment. So if you went above and beyond, right, if you remember early on our New York Times test, that's the stuff we want to put on the front page. You were doing more than you were required by the assistance given for this program. You were running your business and paying your people. That's fantastic.
Okay.
And you know, and the reality is that I would expect just about everyone is going to submit more wages during their 24-week covered period than what they qualified for, because it's a 10-week versus 24-week formula. I would expect that to be the norm, not the exception.
Okay. But you still wouldn't apply for forgiveness until after that 24-week period has lapsed.
Correct.
Simply
because of the documentation. Yep. Go ahead.
The documentation, and then also how do you prove that you maintained FTEs for 24 weeks if those 24 weeks haven't happened yet?
Okay. Related to the FTEs, if your FTE count is reduced because of COVID-related issues, will that affect your PPP forgiveness amount?
So, not necessarily. There is an exception that says that if you can document that you had to reduce FTEs in order to comply with COVID restrictions, and essentially you need to show that there was a shutdown order or something like that for your jurisdiction, which I think about every state that's represented here had some sort of shutdown, but it depends on what industry you're in. But essentially, you need to document that. Yeah, okay, you know, I had to reduce my work pool because either my state said that I was not an essential business and said I had to shut down, or I had to reduce staffing in order to achieve social distancing or something like that. You have to show that you were complying with CDC recommendations, essentially. If you can document that and show that, you know, this is the reason why I had to reduce, yes, that is a carve out. Those reductions, those FTE reductions don't count against you. And then, you know, along with that, if you laid off some people and then rehired before the end of your covered period or December 31st, that's also an exception where those FTE reductions would not count against you. So there are some carve outs there for some of those unique sort of circumstances.
Okay. Another question about the application period. Our 24-week period will end in October 25, but we've already used all of our loans proceeds back in September. Can we go on and apply now because with our third quarter filings?
Well, if you do, I think your documentation is going to be incomplete because you have more than an 8-week covered period that you used. You didn't need all 24, but your choices are 8 or 24. So you need to provide the documentation for the entire 24-week covered period. So if you apply before the end of that, I don't think you're going to be able to show the documentation that you had FTEs maintained for that 24-week covered period, and you're not going to have the last section of that for your payroll tax returns either.
Okay. Question about number of employees. If we have part-time employees who are not employed, well, I'm not sure what this is as. I'll just read it out. What if part-time were not employed during FTE period, but worked this summer only in addition to FTE employees? I'm guessing they're maybe asking about their reference period for the first part of that.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm going to interpret the same way, Chris. So the FTE calculation is not employee specific. In other words, you're not putting names associated with those FTEs. They are, number of hours by employee worked compared to number of hours worked by all employees in the reference periods. And remember, that's how these calculations work. You compare the FTEs that were working during your covered period to certain reference periods for the FTEs as January 1st to February 29th or February 15th to June 30th of 2019. You have the choice of either of those reference periods, and your goal is to pick the lower of the two because that gives you the easier path to avoiding reductions. As long as those FTEs were equal to or greater than in your covered period than one of those reference periods, then there will be no reduction. But it's not employee specific. So theoretically, you could have a completely different set of employees that worked during the reference period than whom worked during your covered period, and you'll still be fine as long as the FTE counts came out in your favor. So no, it doesn't matter, the names in there. Now that is different than the wage reduction. We haven't had any questions about that, but there is a wage reduction, rate of pay reduction potential in there, and that is employee specific. So that's where they're looking at, who was employed at the beginning of the year, and did you cut their pay during the covered period? So in other words, someone was, making $12 or $15 an hour in January, and their rate of pay during your covered period was $12 an hour, or let's say $10 an hour, because that would result in a reduction. If that reduction is more than 25%, you get a reduction. So just wanted to mention that is employee specific. So that is where you're comparing employee to employee. And there's a whole bunch of exceptions. And, if you're restored to pay by the end of the covered period, if that person made more than the equivalent of $100,000 in any pay period during 2019, they're not on the list. So there's some nuances with that one as well. Okay.
Question about employees collecting unemployment being laid off. What if most of your employees collected unemployment and you were unable to operate fully due to COVID? Our PPP was done end of April. So they might have an FTE reduction issue there, if I'm understanding it correctly. Do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on there because the first day that I think any PPP loans were funded was April 3rd. So that's far less than 4 weeks. So if you used up all your money right away, then you are going to have to go through and do the math to see what the FTE count was based on people that were on your payroll versus those who were not, and then go through any of the safe harbor calculations as well to see if those calculate in your favor. And also, did you offer to hire them back and they refused because they were getting a bonus $600 a week on unemployment? Because if you made a good faith effort to rehire them and they refused, then that's their decision that won't count against you. Likewise, if they decided they got a new job or they just didn't want to work anymore, they retired, when it was the employee's decision to stay out on unemployment or to not continue working, right? That's on them. That's not on you. So you have to take that on a individual basis for each of those employees to figure out how that will affect your application.
Okay. Another one is we had quite a few employees voluntarily leave employment not laid off, are those two situations factored differently, or will just FTEs be a factor?
So, Erin mentioned this just a second ago, but if it's the employee's idea, the employee chose to leave your business, they're not working, or they chose not to come back because of safety concerns, or what doesn't matter what the reason was. They chose not to come back. You offered them the job and were unable to hire them or an equivalent replacement, right? So, just because Bob didn't come back, if you were able to hire, someone who could do the same job as Bob, that person's FTE would count in place of Bob. But let's say Bob was a highly specialized employee and you were not able to find an employee with that same skill set during your covered period, then that does not count against you in the FTE reduction. The key thing is you need documentation, written documentation that you made an offer and the employee refused it. And so that's where, certainly you need to make sure you have that in place. You can't just go in there and just, start saying after the fact, well, I tried to hire him back, but he didn't say, and not show any documentation that existed. So you need to have the written documentation of a job offer and ideally a written refusal from the employee. Now, we know that that part is not absolutely required because, the employee, you can't require somebody to sign something that's not working for you, right? So that part, but that would be, in my opinion, a very solid documentation that somebody says, no, I'm not working for you. It's my voluntarily am refusing work. And so that's some very solid documentation for that.
Okay. Another question about FTE calculations. How do you figure FTEs when all your employees are part-time? Is it just the total hours worked divided by 40?
Yeah, so remember, a full-time equivalent is the math to figure out if I was running my business with full-timers only, how many people would it take? So I'm going to add up all the hours worked for that person in that particular week, and then I'm going to divide that by 40. So as Keith said before, if I worked 20 hours out of a 40-hour week, I'm going to be at 0.5 FTE. If I work 10 out of 40, I'm going to be at 0.25. You also have to, for this exercise, because this is SBA's requirement, make sure that you cap it at 40. So even if I worked overtime and I was 50 hours a week, I'm still going to count for a maximum of 1 FTE.
Okay, so let's say we have, just to work through a very quick, easy example, let's say we have Joe that works 60 hours, Liz works 20, and Bob works 20. That would be 2 FTEs because you have one full-timer that exceeds 40 hours, so he's 1. And then you have 2 people that effectively work half time, so they each count as half.
Yeah.
Okay. Question about documentation of employees' reason for leaving. If an employee voluntarily departs, do you need a letter of resignation or some kind of signed document that it's voluntary, or would documentation from the employer side only be sufficient?
From the employer side only would be sufficient because, again, it's unreasonable to expect the employer to be able to, get an employee who leaves voluntarily to, sign something that says I'm leaving voluntarily. Now, that being said, if you get the employee to sign something voluntarily, that makes that that's what, we would call the belt and suspenders approach, right? You technically only need one, but if you have both, you're extra safe. So if you have that, great. If not, you just need to document that this, and that's you've documented a written job offer. You put in writing that, I am offering you a job at XYZ, wage and this, that, and the other, and put that in the file that with a note that employee refused or left on such and such a date.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, we're kind of caught up on questions here. I'll remind the audience that they can type in questions into the chat and we'll ask them. It is 10 o'clock, so we're kind of at our time, but I'll give just a minute here for any last stragglers, if you have any questions, to type them in. In the meantime, I'll ask Keith and Erin if you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom for us.
I put the slide back up with our summary of the key points. These are the points we want you to remember. Don't worry about a deadline. You're not missing a deadline if you don't get your application submitted this year. And the reality is you're going to be with good company in 2021 applying for forgiveness. And
Okay.
after today, this is the last of these webinars that we have scheduled. So note those web addresses for how you reach out to us for additional information. Okay.
Actually, a good question just came in, and I'll make it our last one here. We had a couple, it relates to that sort of obligation you alluded to find a replacement worker if one leaves. We had a couple employees who worked during our chosen test period, but retired early in our 24-week covered period, and we did not plan to replace them. Do we need to replace those people with an equivalent worker, or can we just have our workforce reduced?
Sounds like the employees made a choice not to work anymore. So that does not count against you.
Okay, so if someone leaves voluntarily, you don't have an obligation to try and find an equivalent employee elsewhere?
Correct.
That's correct. There is a discussion in there that says, and maybe I stated it so that it was a little confusing, but there's essentially it says that if an employee leaves for any reason, including you firing them for cause or laying them off or something like that, and an equivalent, if that employee, what the language that they used originally was, and that employee is not rehired, but they expanded that to or an equivalent replacement. So they allowed for, if you can, if somebody quits and then you were not able to find somebody doing the exact same job, you didn't just have to. That allowed for the flexibility on the employer part to be selective in who they hired to make sure they were hiring someone who had the correct skills. So, as a quick example, if your bookkeeper left and you were trying to rehire and you had the opportunity to hire somebody with zero bookkeeping skills, you would not be expected to have had hired that individual. You can be selective in who you rehire. So, but there's not generally a rehire requirement. You just document. The main thing is documenting that it was the employee's idea. The employee retired early. The employee chose not to work. The employee, the ones that refuse to come off of unemployment, there's some additional requirements to submit to essentially report that to the unemployment office. But all others, if they, say they left for a job at another place, just document that in writing and say, John Smith offer made and showed that the written offer of employment and that they were refused offer, or, in your payroll files that John Smith resigned today, and you should be good.
Okay. I know I said the previous question was the last one, but I'm going to make an exception here. A question ripped from the headlines here. The Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said yesterday that SBA will start forgiving the 96,000 applications that have been submitted within the next 14 days. He encouraged businesses to apply and not wait for new legislation. Does that change anything in your viewpoint as far as forgiveness applications?
No, that'll be a really good 2 weeks to learn exactly what went well in that first batch and what didn't. I think what he's pointing to is new legislation, meaning what's Congress going to do, not what is SBA going to do with the ones that they already have, if you see the distinction. So they're going to run through and approve or not approve. We're going to learn a lot about what has happened with those 96,000 applications, and then we'll have some real good information there. That doesn't change whether or not you are eligible to apply at this point. So we will make sure that until Congress has any further changes, we're going to go with the rules that we have right now and go by what they've got. So keep in mind, the instructions are all out there. Head over to farmcrediteast.com/resource hub. You can read through all of the instructions for the application for forgiveness to make sure that you've got all the documentation you need. And if SBA is approving ones that are eligible to apply right now, awesome. We'll know exactly what we need to do next. And if you have met the criteria and are eligible to apply, then we'll start with those. If you do need to wait for your documentation to be filed so that you have all the things that you need, then we're going to continue with that schedule as set.
Thank you for your time. Thank you, Keith and Erin, for your expertise. And we are adjourned.